I'm Jacob Wussner. I was born and raised in Missoula, Montana. My father was working for a commercial beekeeper when I was very young and started his own business. So I kind of grew up working with the bees with my father and then with another beekeeper as well in Missoula. I went to college in Northland College for the majority of my career, and that's in Ashland, Wisconsin. I studied environmental studies, mostly with emphasis in public policy. I came back to Missoula and continued working for my father, and then with my brother started Wussner Brothers Honey 2011, and then a couple years later I kind of handed off Wussner Brothers Honey and started my own side business called Sapphire Permaculture Apiary, which I recently changed the name to Sapphire Apiaries, but I'm still doing bees for the majority of my income, but looking to expand into consulting not only for beekeeping but permaculture as well, and doing permaculture design and earthworks. My plan is to focus on organic, natural, traditional beekeeping practices that I have learned either from beekeepers I've worked for or through reading on the internet, basically, and trying to find out better ways of doing things. How they're doing. First things first, light a smoker. Even if you plan on not using the smoker, a lot of times of the year you don't need to, especially when they're on a heavy honey flow. I'd say always have it on hand, because you never know what's going to happen. And when you need it, you don't want to have to take the time to light it, because you'll be getting eaten alive, basically. These bees probably will be pretty calm.
Are they Italian bees?
Mostly. And they haven't been messed with, although I moved them in here a few days ago. If you are moving bees, you probably don't want to open them up that day or maybe a few days afterwards. This is kind of pushing it, but the more you mess with them, the grumpier they'll be. So if you can really leave them as much as possible, they'll be happier. So I like to use burlap because it's natural. I can source it locally for cheap, and you know, it's something that lights really easily, doesn't catch on fire too fast, although it will. You kind of have to keep an eye on it. But I've experimented with a lot of different things like pine cones and cow pies and buffalo chips and half-rotten wood. And burlap is just, it's easy to cut up, and I don't really have to, you know, worry about where I'm going to find it. You can take your time to let them move out of the way, or you can get a bee brush or use your fingers. So now this has nectar in it. You can see it shining. Today's topics are learning more about bees and their cycles. We're learning about the blooms of the flowers in our area and the brood cycles of the honeybees. This is leafy spurge. It's considered a noxious weed in the state of Montana. This plant in western Montana probably is one of the most significant for honeybees in terms of how much honey they get, and even a little bit of pollen, but it's mostly the honey that they get from this plant that enables honeybees to thrive here. Without this plant and other plants, honeybees wouldn't survive here. Generally, you try to stand to the side and not in front of the entrance. If they're going in and out, which they are doing already, they don't like something in the way of their home. If you're to the side, they don't really notice you as much. So even if you just stand in front of the hive like this and get your face down low, after a while they're going to start bumping into you, and if it's a strong hive, they're going to start attacking you. So stand off to the side or the back, whichever. Just try to minimize your time in front of the hive. Once you get it opened, you're kind of, you know, in the hive, and they're going to get angry and upset anyway. But that's where the smoke comes in. So today we're going to talk about 4 main issues which kind of pertain to this season. It is about the middle of July, and we're nearing kind of the last main honey flow of the year. Because we are in a drier climate, the honey flow usually ends in August sometime. Sometimes it goes through September, and it just all depends on the weather. So first we're going to talk about whether or not to harvest honey from your hive. And most people just assume that every year they're going to get honey. But usually a good beekeeper will be very careful about whether or not to harvest honey from their hive the first year of a new hive's life, because if you take too much honey away from that hive and they run out in the middle of the winter, you either have to A, feed them, which I hate going to bees in the winter, or let them die. And different honeybees are better at conserving honey in the winter, so part of it has to do with your honeybees and where you got the genetics from, and whether or not they're very conservative with their honey stores or they go through them very fast. What do you want to do? We're basically just going to open and inspect the hive for honey, pollen, and brood, and make sure there's a good healthy queen, she's got a good pattern, and that they've got enough pollen and honey to make it through the winter. We're not going to harvest today, but we're going to evaluate whether or not we're going to be able to harvest next time. And so as you can see, this is what we call 4 high. There's 4 deeps here. So I'm considering these 3 the brood nest. Most beekeepers might consider just the top 2, and they'll take these 2 off when they go to take the honey off. I will just take this one off, given that there's enough honey down here. If there's not enough honey down here, I'll probably just take whatever honey is in here and exchange it for empty frames down here, so that they get all their own honey that they'll need for the winter, while keeping them in this space that I can knock it back down to 3 for the winter. I could just leave this on till the spring, but I like wintering them when they're a little bit lower to the ground. That's a lot of space for them to fill. Smoke on. But yeah, just go towards the corner and slide your tool in. It's glued from the propolis, so it takes a little while, but once you get it cracked off, you can kind of feel it. And I slide it a little bit forward so it doesn't fall off, and then tilt it back. And if you keep the edge of the box on here, there's a little depression in here, you won't crush the bees right under here. If you don't keep it on the edge and you put it right on the top bars, you might crush bees. So I can see some sealed honey in here. There's not a ton of bees in here, but there's a nice cluster here. I don't see any brood up here, which doesn't surprise me. It should mostly be honey. They store honey at the top, and then the pollen kind of to the sides.